Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover and people will be trickling in, I think. I know most of you. Anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Mike. Susan and I have been members of Westminster since about 1987. And so we have a lot to discuss, and I appreciate your interest in the topic. What I thought we'd do is start out of context of, what I have to say in the book and the themes of that. How would you describe your most important values? What are the things that are really important to you? I think we all know most of what's going to be said, but let's just get it out there. Peace, security. What else? Family. Sorry. Faith. Reality. That's a good one. Anything else? The second step here is to, and one of the things that I deal with in the book is confidence in those values. If you were to have to put a percentage on those values and how important, how valid they are, how reliable they are, what would you say? They right about half the time? They're right maybe 10 or 20% of the time? 98? Have you ever thought about that? Okay. Yes, we'll get into that point. It's an important one. Any other comments about that? Part of what we're going to talk about is value rivalry and how many values compete with one another, and we have to give up some on one or the other. We have this in our tradition. This is really not from the book because it's not specifically a Presbyterian or religious book. We have this in our scripture. We want to do what's good and don't. Do we know what's good? Bob, you just said 100% on your values. Yeah. So sometimes our values might be compromised or conflicted. Yeah. Well, exactly. We live in groups, don't we? So it's not just one of us, but there's a lot of answers to the question. So this kind of guidance is only partly helpful in my view, because it doesn't tell us what is good. And we mostly probably would resist an absolute description of what we have to do. Now compare this to elections. There's a lot of different ideas of good and different ideas of bad, but we just can't agree. If we knew what was good, we would just agree on it and proceed, right? We don't really know what's good, or we don't agree on what's good, I think might be one tentative conclusion from that. So a lot of the things that deal with this problem have to do with attitudes and process. We should be gracious. We should be curious. We should listen to people. All those things are absolutely necessary to get along. But in my opinion, they don't really get at some of the more basic reasons that we disagree. I like this quote, by the way, from Samuel Johnson in terms of attitude. Even people we don't like, we can be kind to. He was a 16th century, an 18th century English literary figure. So there are epigraphs in each of the chapters in the book. It starts out with two ways of looking at something. This is for the preface. I'll give you a second to read them. Have any of you seen these quotes before or thought along these lines before? Yeah. I think these set the tone for what we're going to be talking about, because these values are in conflict and we have to balance them. We have to sort of rank them, accept some, subdue others, depending on the situation. This is kind of the same question again. We may be good people trying hard, and we still are polarized. This is from Monica Guzman, who works for Braver Angels. And I just encountered this even since I finished writing and publishing the book, which means in the last month. And I think she really says it well. A lot of times we think that people that oppose us hate what we love, and they're out to get what we love. That certainly seems to describe a lot of the behavior that we see in the popular culture these days. Would you agree? So let's start in with a few of these values. Equality is really much in the conversation these days. How many believe it's really important, or is it kind of important? Really important? Top importance? Anybody think that it's kind of so-so? Yeah, that makes it a hard question. You know, a lot of people are willing to answer quickly that they believe in equality without any of those considerations. It's important, but it's certainly a good question because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Michael, I'm interested in your renegade attitude that it's not always so important. Yeah. Which sort of gets to Bob's point. What kind of equality are we talking about? Natural equality, legal equality, et cetera. And part of the answer to your question would depend on which one of those roads we're going down. But I want to ask in a very similar way about liberty. Who thinks this is of prime importance? Maybe a third? And who thinks it's really kind of come and go? We ought to have some of it, but it should be heavily controlled. Oh, good. You're a good one, Mike. Controlled. This is not one of the trade-offs that's dealt with in this book. Some of you who've seen it, and Bob right away got the book and said there's a 1 on the spine. What does that mean? It means it's volume 1 because there's a lot more to come if people are interested in this. So liberty and equality is one of the future trade-offs to discuss. But take a look. Did everyone know who Will and Ariel Durant are? Yeah, they wrote this long story of civilization, like an encyclopedia length. And at the end, they wrote a book called The Lessons of History, 150 pages. And this is from that book. Roman Catholic slam. I don't know. I didn't know that they were Catholic. I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah. Do you think that this kind of trade-off is related to that history, or is it a trade-off? Yeah. No, I don't know. This is a rather unflinching look at a give or take zero sum kind of thing, right? We can have more equality, but if we do, we have less liberty. Right. I happen to believe this strongly, and I'm sort of with Mike. We are unequal. We're different, and we're unequal simply because of that. We can't be made to be the same if we understand equality is the same. So you end up with, excuse me, other kinds of equality, like legal equality. Everybody deserves a fair chance, a square deal, that kind of thing. But that's kind of not what we talk about in our culture these days about what equality means. We need similar outcomes. And we can't have similar outcomes. We have different burdens, different abilities, different talents. And to achieve even a close approximation of equality would require massive impingements on liberty. This is another way of saying the same thing. It's shorter. This guy is a think tank kind of guy, an economics professor. So let's take a look at another one. We hear peace all the time, especially in our religious tradition. Is it important? Most of us agree that it is. Michael, you want to disagree with that one? But not outer peace? Very interesting. What about this one? We normally encounter these independently, right? And somebody talks about being righteous, being good, we're all for it. But we don't see the hidden alternative or the hidden cost because righteousness is often unpeaceful. You know, one of the examples I use in my book is, you know, my mother used to make me practice piano a lot more than I wanted to. But it was anything but peaceful, and I'm glad that she did it. A lot of things that we do, David Brooks is very articulate on this, that the things we admire in people are the things that are hard, the things that cost them. And they give up peace, particular peace of mind, in order to accomplish some of those things. So these things are directly competitive, you might say. Would anyone disagree with this idea that these generally align with the idea of being at ease or being in a contest, being in a fight? This is one of the major themes of the first chapter of Deep Trade-Offs, that we always have this conflict about whether to strive or rest. Take a look at what Einstein says. Any agreement? Disagreement? One thing I'll point out about this is that he has a little trick here in the first line where he says ease and happiness. Those are not necessarily the same thing, although we tend to think of happiness as being unburdened, being on vacation, being joyous, being unconflicted, not having people yell at us, right? But it's not necessarily quite the same. But he's clearly on the idea of, on the side of ease and peace and an absence of conflict. Now let's add this. Has anybody ever said this? So what does this mean? What do we mean when we say we want our kids to be happy? Do we want them to be at ease, unburdened, unconflicted, striving for little, accomplishing not much? It's really not what we mean, right? We mean we want them to have a good, free from anxiety. Virtuous, yes, which is, yes. Which is sort of along the lines of what Einstein said, right? Honor and nobility and effort and things like that. The point here is that we say these things independently of context, and we don't realize what we're giving up when we affirm these values. And so, this is my favorite, one of my favorites. This guy is the father of Angela Duckworth. She was Angela Lee, as her maiden before she married. And she wrote the book Grit. Many of you have heard of that. It's about being tenacious, and over a long time, that success is more controlled by effort, steady, long-term effort with a lot of failures along the way. It is not peaceful. It's hard. And that's what some of the most successful people have done over long periods of time. She got this from her father. He was, I think, an immigrant. He was an industrial chemist at DuPont. Yes. Yeah. But consider this. Does anybody volunteer for that? Michael? Doug? Yeah. It's sort of in the Presbyterian tradition, isn't it? That we're fallen, that we're weak. Yes. It's not a lot of people that admit to this, right? Isn't that right? You must have had a defective education if it produced that, right? Yeah. You know, it's one of the things I most treasure about our Presbyterian tradition is that we focus on that and we remind ourselves that we're not all that we think we are. I think that's absent in a lot of the civil disputes that we have, because people think they're right and are willing to defend it, whether they're right or wrong, and not really considering that they might be wrong. And we'll talk a little bit about the psychological things behind that. And those are these. You heard of confirmation bias? It's a well-known bias to psychologists. By the way, they have documented well over 100 biases that we have in our brains. They're shortcuts. Michael's a neurologist. He's nodding his head. He knows this very well. By the way, scholarly attention to this is only 20 or 30 years old. They were just starting to talk about this when I went to business school, because every one of us thought we're rational, reasonable people. We look at the evidence and we make a judicious choice, and we generally do it well, right? Now these psychologists are beginning to say that's not at all true, that we have beliefs that we take into a situation. We judge what we hear based on that belief, and we reject it or accept it by whether it conforms to our worldview. And we're looking for ways to confirm. And so to extend this, that makes us partial, makes us unbalanced, and it makes us disrespectful of competing ideas. That's right. That's exactly right. The way I remember some psychologists describing this is that we go into situations looking to survive and to have our belief system survive. Because if our belief system's wrong, we're not going to do very well. We need it to be right, and we need to defend that it's right. So when these belief systems clash, we're not generally listening to improve ours. We're 100%, Bob, right? We're 100% convinced that our values are the right ones. So we're not. You might say that. You might say that. And that's one of the processes that, you know, we talked on a minute ago, is that people emphasize that aspect of behavior. What I'm trying to dig at is the values underneath it that make us behave that way. Right. So we often, and I'll give you an example. I just read something this morning. I'll just tell you now. Somebody sent me an email wanting me to read a book about Laodicea. How do you say that, guy? In Turkey, Laodicea. Okay. Laodicea was a prosperous Christian city, but Christ's letter to the church there contained a harsh rebuke. The church's complacent and pleasure-seeking nature was not compatible with the nature of Christ. There's still time to answer Christ's knock on the door. This was a city known for self-reliance, bankers, garments. Christ called the church to put worldly things aside and become passionate again about living for the kingdom. Does that resonate with anybody about what we've been talking about? It's about righteousness. It's not peaceful. It's also not very balanced, right? It's an advocacy. So by the way, in advocacy media, we hear this all the time. It used to be that people, tried to, what was the Saturday Night Live joke about the Dick and Jane, where they pretended to be balanced, but they were really pretty violently not. The other part of this, and some of you will recognize these habits, once we see a need to confirm what we already believe, we start reasoning to defend that belief. It's called motivated reasoning. It's very familiar to psychologists. And these are two giveaways. We're not listening to change our views because we're already 100%. And so if we rate our values as certain, as reliable, we're not listening to change. We're not listening to get better, expecting the other people to listen and get better. So these are universal tendencies and they're subconscious. We're not really even aware of them. Okay, so let's talk about how this book came about. I grew up in Donaldson, had an uncle that was an engineer that designed the scanner systems for IBM, and I just wanted to be Bill Steele. And so I went to engineering school, and so I'm educated originally as an engineer, and that'll become important as we go down the list. I went to business school because I felt like in engineering school, I was being trained for a profession rather than being educated more broadly. I'm really curious about a lot of things like philosophy, and I wasn't getting it. So I sort of shifted to business. And then when I came back to Nashville, went back to Vanderbilt and got another degree in the humanities. So all three of those kind of perspectives come into the discussion that the book presents. I moved to Nashville to start a business called Knowledge Products. And Susan and I joined Westminster, I think, in 1987, after moving back here in 85. So for about 15 years, I was working on audio productions on the great ideas of history. And we used a lot of quotes. In this book, there's about 277 sources, 315 quotes with a narrative that kind of connects them together. So it's not really about what I think, it's about looking at what other people think and how these things relate to one another. In the mid-90s, we had gone beyond philosophy and economics and science and religion, and we decided to try moral problems of our age. And during this experience as the general editor of this, I started to see these are not problems like problems as I understand them as an engineer. They're not solvable like an engineering problem is. There's no equation that's going to address it. These are separately valid imperatives, principles, values, beliefs that are in conflict, and they're not resolvable. And the one that stood out to me is abortion, because autonomy is a value that any person in a free society should rate very highly. But so is respect for life, so is respect for law. And there are several others that get mixed in, and it's not resolvable. So I began to see these dualities and what I call dualities, sometimes binaries. KC gave a sermon one Sunday on justice and mercy in the Presbyterian tradition. He said, if we got what we deserved, we might not like it. So we depend on grace and mercy. Well, I've been saying the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag for a long time. And they say justice and mercy for all, liberty and equality. Those things come, and we believe in them both. We might think they're 100% values, but we can't have them 100% because they compete. Another thing I saw during that period is attributed to James Michener. There's a little bit of controversy about whether it's Michener. And I'll show you this quote in length later. Actually, I should just read it. Our dreams, see the permanent tragedy of life is to confuse dreams with reality. And the permanent failure of life is to give up on our dreams, basically is what it says. This is the second chapter, by the way, ideals and reality. Someone mentioned reality as a value. We constantly are caught between ought and is, the way we think things ought to be and the way things really are. We have very different ideas about which direction ought goes, and we fight over making it that way. So what I did over time is I inventoried values. I looked up different lists of values and I added them all up, and they don't all include the same ones. I just added them all together and deduplicated, and there's over almost 300 values. And I'm starting to develop a theory that may get more well-developed if I write more of these books, that every value has a valid competitor. Every value. And we could do some exercises and think about things that we think are values alone that aren't challenged, that aren't compromised by something else. But I was just thinking this morning, what about security? Everybody wants security. What's a value that competes with security? Freedom. Hospitality. Yeah, hospitality. With the business background that I have, I think of risk. If you're going to be completely secure, you're going to take no risk. And because I started new business and they were full of risk. And so without risk, you have very little change and very little innovation. Right. So the theory, the thesis of this book is that polarization is highly energized by value conflicts that we don't recognize. We know them. We all know these values. When we talk about them, we see that they're somewhat in conflict, but we hear about equality and we're all for it. We hear about liberty and we're all for it, but we're not making the trade-off because they're not often presented. And once you start to think this way, you start to see these everywhere. I saw it this morning in an email that came, and it was a very vigorous advocacy of some kind of righteousness. And I can recognize right away that they are advocating no peace. Oh, I went backwards somehow. So there's 4 chapters in the book. There's a preface, which is sort of a meditation on symmetry and having 2 sides to everything. And the example that I start with is my body, my choice. We've all heard this. What is that about? Any volunteers? Abortion. And vaccines, yes. So you're right up with me. It's used on both sides to reach completely opposite conclusions. One means it's none of your business if I have an abortion. Leave me alone. I have a right to it. By the way, a rights claim, and I learned this from my work at Knowledge Products, a rights claim basically is a declaration of independence. It says, I get to decide. It's not your business. It's not the government's business. It's not her business. It's my right. And so it's kind of exclusionary in that way, and it pushes away compromise and interference by law. And that's what really both sides are saying on abortion and on vaccination. You have no right to tell me I have to take a vaccination, right? So part of this then comes down to how do we address this? A lot of people address these problems by declaring their rights and being rather demonstrative about how they ought to be left alone. Other people focus on relationships and how do we enter a dialogue with somebody that gets to some agreement. Those are generally foreclosed by a lot of the way we talk to one another. Biases, we have hundreds of them. They're normal. If you hear about this in the popular culture, it's a deviancy that's got to be fixed right away. Right? Prejudice, I think, can be understood the same way. It's a prejudgment. We all have prejudgments unless we don't believe anything, unless we don't prefer anything. Any objections or thoughts? Yes, Eli. Yes. Yes.
what you can see is that some people agree with me, some don't. These sorts of decisions in a legal sense, they're very much subjective and often value-based. And what you're going to see all the time is that judges don't see it the same way. It's subjective, there's no absolute right answer. And I think it's important to realize, just like professions, I think people do that all the time when they make these choices, including about my choice or other ones. They are subjective, and part of what is so important about what you're saying is a lot of times people will look at subjective choices that people make about whether one matters or the other. They'll sort of act like the other person is like almost factually wrong, but they're really not. It's subjective call, and they may see a slightly different definition of that person.
For anyone who doesn't know, Eli is a federal judge, so he knows whereof he speaks. So again, this point of recognizing hidden alternatives, if we begin to see symmetry and understand that almost any value has something to challenge it, we can think in a more balanced way and have really a better posture. You get the idea, I think, that these are two facially opposite ways of encountering life. You know, are they both wrong? Are they both right? Well, it's a good question. You know, Thomas Jefferson said a similar thing about a peaceful life. And then he said that if you don't have a revolution every once in a while and spill the blood of tyrants, that you can't have freedom. So we vacillate on these. We go back and forth. Neither one is correct. They're rivals, right? There's a couple of themes. So now I'm basically taking you through the chapters. We talked about the introduction, which is about symmetry and this whole idea that there's balance in values. And then there's 3 chapters about specific value conflicts. Okay, one of them is peace and striving, you know, rest or confrontation. You can put a bunch of names around that, but we do this all the time. We decide what we're going to fight about and what we're going to accept and forgive and live with. A couple of important things come out of that. It's very clear in the psychological studies that happiness does not come from peaceful rest. It's not passive, it's active. People are happy when they are engaged in something that's meaningful to them. And so don't look for happiness sitting watching TV or going on vacation. I have a cousin that read this and she said, I never realized that on my vacations, I'm really looking for things. I'm getting collections. I'm out doing things that are meaningful to me. So retirement and passivity is not the way to be happy. So activity is the way to find meaning. So that's one of the themes that comes out of this chapter. Each chapter is about 40 or 50 pages. So then what are we striving for? The rivalry is really captured in the first quote that I forgot that I had put in here in my visuals, so I shouldn't have been trying to look it up. But the second one is interesting to me because it's challenging the way we think about perfection and utopias. This chapter starts off with a discussion of several attempts at building utopias. They fail within 2 years. And there's never been a successful utopia. So some of the themes that come out of this chapter are ideology, which generally I think maps as ideals, that we shouldn't have fossil fuels. We shouldn't have government in some people's case, view. You see what I'm getting at? We have a lot of people that are committed, and people will die for their ideals and they will lie for their ideals. I think that's unchallengeable. So then this is the third chapter. Yes, Jackie. Well, it's integral to it. If we don't engage with one another and understand one another and maximize common ground, we're never going to all be the same. We're never going to all agree. Compromise is necessary if we're going to have any kind of unity. Yes, at least things that people can accept. I may not like what you do, but I'm willing to accept it because it's the price of liberty. Right? It may not really be common ground in the way that we might think that I like it or agree with it. I can be kind to somebody I don't like. Right? Does it then respond to your question? Okay. Can lose an argument and still be a good person. Actually, it's a pretty good idea to lose an argument occasionally if you're married. One of the things interesting about this chapter, and I say it, who believes that there's a rivalry between honesty and deception? We're all for honesty, aren't we? Who's not for honesty? Well, then the question is, why do we deceive so much? It's rampant, and you can't read this chapter without seeing it. We all are deceiving ourselves and other people all the time. We will claim that we're honest right after telling our kids about Santa Claus. Okay, the point is not that we're bad to tell them it's Santa Claus, it's that there's another value that's being sought by telling that story. It's to give our children joy. And so we engage in lots of fictions because they give us joy. By the way, Kate Bowler has been here and spoken here. We'll be seeing her in another week with Ken and some others that are going to Chautauqua in New York, where Kate will be. She's fantastic. And her experience of getting cancer in her early 30s with a young child makes her just vibrantly expressive about how to be truthful and honest about what's going on, not deny that she's sick, not to pretend that some magic is going to happen. She's a well-trained theologian and very articulate on these things. I'm trying not to overdrive this microphone, so that's the reason I may sound rather reserved, but these things can get pretty excitable. So here, let's look at some of the themes in honesty and deception. They're some of my favorites. We talked about objective and subjective. Someone raised that earlier, Eli. When I was being trained as an engineer and when I was growing up, I thought reason is what leads to facts. Feelings are what leads to subjective things, right? And so if you are adequately analytical, you can come to facts, and that's objective. What I've learned from doing this work is that's not at all true. We go into situations trying to assert our beliefs, affirm our beliefs, and what we think is a fact is really an artifact of the belief system we took into it. If you want to get objective, you have to get other people involved, and that's what science does. It's based on skepticism and criticism, and people are poor critics of their own behavior. We all are. And so to get at something that's objective means that a lot of people agree on it. It's not doable by one person. Okay, so there's a lot of power in that in dealing with understanding disagreements as subjective or objective. You could just look, is it one person or a bunch of people who have agreed? Even people who have agreed doesn't make it a permanent fact. And there's some discussion in here of some philosophers of science that say all facts are tentative. They're capable of being overturned by new evidence. Right? We thought Newton's laws describe motion. Well, they do within this frame of reference, but they don't at the cosmological scale for planets. They don't at the subatomic scale. They're not overturned. They're not false. They're just not adequate. They're half-truths. And I think there's a lot of reason to say almost everything we know is a half-truth because it's challengeable by another truth, and it only applies in some situations. Okay, we think we see things as they are, don't we? We see things as we are. That's what psychologists say. Michael's a neurologist. He's very familiar with this. We take our belief systems into things and we impose it on what we see, and we see what we expect to see, or what we want to see, what we hope to see. And this third one then is my favorite. It's a little difficult, but let me try this quickly. There's two types of truth. There's corresponding truth and coherent truth. We're taught corresponding truth in science. It means that theory accurately describes the reality. We're all familiar with this. Everybody's heard that, right? It's what we think truth is. There's a lot of things that we don't have evidence for, particularly metaphysical things, things that are important to us in religion, in church. There's not much evidence about hope, love, forgiveness, fear. Those things are intangible. So there's not really a good way to match evidence to a theory. So what we do instead is we have coherent systems that say these things fit together. If that is true, this must be true. My coherence is a lot different than yours, and we fight about it because we think we're defending truth. We've all heard about relativism and objections to, my truth. It's not really truth. It's really tough here to understand this and to get clear on, is truth T with a small, truth with a small t or with a capital T? Absolute, unchallengeable truth. Does that make sense to anybody? Hopefully it does. Greg? Yes, I think so. I would think so. Yes. Yes, I think that's accurate. And at risk of overstatement that everything is a half truth, it's true that I am speaking in it's not all that I am. There's other things going on, right? And so you could challenge that on some, but it's picayune. Nobody reasonable is going to fight about whether I'm speaking in a microphone. But at the margin, these things become really important where the difference is distinct. She's, I think, speaking of her experience as a mother, as a religious person, and the things that she holds very dear. And to her, I think what she's saying is, I'm sick. And I need to acknowledge that I'm sick, not pretend that I'm not, and face that and all of the theological things that go with that. It's really a very admirable thing. A lot of people hope for miracle cures and things like that. Who would take that away from anybody, right? What I understand her to be saying here is that she's found peace by looking reality square in the eye and admitting it. I think so. I think so. I don't think she's making a huge metaphysical claim. Do you know, Ken? Am I right on that? Okay. So this is the kind of overview of the whole thing. There's a preface on symmetry, looking at 3 different specific trade-offs. And then there's a chapter that's sort of a medley of the things that people do to deal with this, the way we talk to one another, the way that we deal when they're asked questions, and things like that. Some really very useful frameworks, by the way, from some people about how to deal with really rabid disagreement. And then there's indexes. This is intended to be a resource for conversations so that people can read a quote and take it away and think about it and maybe want to discuss it with somebody, and you can find it quickly. There's as I said, 315 quotes. This is an example of the kind of people that are quoted, all the way from, Cicero to my friend Chris. I was in my friend Chris's home one time, staying in his guest bedroom, and his wife had put up a little framed thing that said, "What if you could trade fear for curiosity?" And she was trying to encourage her daughter. And Chris had put a little Post-it note beside it that said, if a grizzly bear is nearby, it would be a bad trade. Here's another trade-off for you. And there's about 8 pages of this kind of subject index. You see there's a lot of philosophy in here about what science is, what respect is. Science fiction, by the way, you see a little entry there. Arthur Clarke has 3 laws that are kind of interesting. And it turns out that science fiction envisions a lot of things that come true. I don't like science fiction, and so I didn't know this, but autonomous cars, all kinds of things, VCRs, they were first conceived in science fiction. Last thing I'll say is that it is tough to publish a book. This is a true figure. I've heard that it's up to 4 million if you include all self-published books. So it's pretty tough to get noticed. And so if this interests you, if you think you know people who would like to engage this topic, it would help me if you would let them know, particularly on social media. And I'm looking for feedback as well, because yes, sir. The Christ event? Yes. Pardon me? I'll repeat. Michael was saying it wasn't so much asking a question as it would be interesting to come back maybe on a Wednesday night and talk about how the Christ event affects this kind of discussion about trade-offs and about black and white and yin and yang and other ways of capturing that dynamic. Is that? Speaking of which, Ming Wang is a friend of mine, and of course is Chinese. I worked with him at Vanderbilt, and let me read what he had to say about this. Deep trade-offs is the ultimate example of the power in combining the wisdom of East and West. The defining features of Eastern philosophy are its sense of balance and dynamic equilibrium. The yin and yang symbol signifies not only what is apparent to most, such as a sense of balance, complementation, and completion of each other, but also a much deeper insight that extreme behaviors can achieve the opposite of the desired result. Now, that last one is new to me. I don't know much about it. I'm eager to learn more. But the Chinese have a few thousand years of thinking about this, and in my view, some pretty sophisticated ways of dealing with it. One other thing I'll say, and I've alluded earlier, is that this is the first of potentially many volumes on this. I have outlined 30 trade-offs that I want to talk about. I do have a cover design for a second one, and it will happen if there's enough interest in it. So that's all of my prepared remarks, but I'd be interested if there's any conversation or questions around this. Good or bad, yay or nay, go or no go. Janet?
In ways they're not either or, and attention to be and seems to be different. And I think those would be interesting to be a lot of conversation.
I fully agree. I looked for other books that made kind of deal with this, and there's not many. There's one that I found was a business book. And what it basically was about was both and transcending. We're so smart, we're going to get above this and we're going to make it all work together. It's kind of what the guy was saying. And so we have to transcend in order to talk with one another, to compromise, I think, but we also have to recognize that we cannot fully transcend. These things are competing, and that's not going away. So it's a hard discussion to keep properly framed about what we can do and what we can't do, I think. Other questions, comments? Eli, then Gregor.
Things, like I said, that not one of the things it's a funny thing because sure many people like these sort of share a certain intent for almost victim mentality, sort of victim statement, all of these books, like almost without exception, even though they're short and they're not comprehensive, every single one of them, to me, contained a great way of putting them together. The other thing I would say is that the current recall, a major trade-off these days is trade-off between value of free speech and extreme ideas versus holding for people's enormous issues.
Right, right. Yeah, one of the future chapters is on law and discretion. It's a proxy for freedom, right? But what needs to be controlled and what really ought to be left to people's conscience. When I get to Greg, what I'll say, I have a cousin that read this early on, and her experience was of engaging a conversation with these quotes, the people that are quoted, because she was hearing them say what they had to say, hearing someone with an opposing view, what they had to say, and she had her own thoughts. And so she experienced it as a conversation she was having with great thinkers. And I like that way of experiencing the book. Greg? It's a great question, and I would hate to summarize it, but let me just say what comes to mind when you ask the question. And then one is that relationships are more important than conclusions. People are not convinced by, they're not argued into accepting something, they're loved into it. Sophie, by the way, that was something in a bulletin here. She was recruiting people for Sunday school, and she said kids are loved into the faith. They're not convinced into it. And I think that's an important thing to reason. So the relationship comes before the agreement. I'm much more willing to agree with people that hear me, treat me decently, accept me, maybe disagree with me. But the ones that want to shout me down, I'm like everyone else. I dig in my heels and fight. Does that answer your question? That's just the first thing that comes to mind. There's, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions, Paul?
One thing's
Well, no compromise is going. And it's unstable. It may be balanced, but as circumstances change, it may become unbalanced. There's always loss. And, this maybe speak to our Presbyterian understanding of fallenness and tragedy. The world's ultimately tragic, and that we cannot have a utopia. And one of the people who talks about these value conflicts says it's a golden zigzag, and there's always loss. Whatever you pick, something is lost because you can't have all of both. So compromise is tentative. And it's the best you can do, and it will change when circumstances change. Does that respond to your question? One thing worth saying is that a lot of times people are now looking for the science to resolve their disputes, and then we get into arguments about what facts are. And judges and science can't resolve our disputes. They have to be done politically with whole humans that have feelings and have reason and have lots of things. That's what legislatures are for, is to put all this in one place and come to some outcome that everyone can live with. It doesn't solve the trade-off. It might optimize it, but it never goes away. And I think it's incumbent on us to always be aware of that and look for ways that we're being arrogant or overbearing in asserting our values and not understanding someone's different life experience may call for a different balance. And so, I mean, I think our political institutions are brilliantly structured to manage balance, checks and balances, trade-offs, et cetera. And it's legislative. We have a lot of fights about the Dobbs decision, taking a right that's unarguable, right, and putting it into state legislatures where people get to fight over it. And if you persuade others, you win. And if you don't persuade others, you don't win. In my view, that's the proper function of a government, is to provide that kind of voice. And if you lose, but you've had a chance to make your case. Yeah, yes. Right. Yeah, I was speaking with Samar Ali this week, who's over at Vanderbilt, teaches with John Meacham, and she has a group called Millions of Conversations. And she was challenging the trade-off between liberty and equality. She said, well, some people who have slaves, I said, I don't know anybody that has slaves or really thinks that that kind of coercion is acceptable. She said, well, I do. In other countries, they do. She knows people that subject people very heavily. And so that liberty equality equation or balance takes a different meaning, and where people believe it's acceptable to subject other people, subdue them and own them. They're enemies. Yeah. Yeah. So if anybody disagrees with everything I think and say in the book, there's still a lot of good quotes in there that will make you think. Okay, thank you all.